Okay, so let's get started. There's actually quite a few of you I hadn't been expecting as much. That's really nice of you to come and listen to my story, or rather our story. So my name is Joel, and I work at the development department at Expressen. Our tagline is Sweden's most brave development department. We're really brave. Considering that we're in Sweden, most of you already know what Expressen is, I'm guessing. Some of you here in Malmö might also know us as Kvällsposten, and if there's one of you from Gothenburg, you probably know us as GT. However, for those of you who don't know us, Expressen is an evening paper, which means that we do quite a lot of stuff like this. Stuff that people want to read. However, we also do quite a lot of stuff like this, stuff that people probably should read. Brief history. Expressen was founded in 1944 as a voice against Nazism in Sweden, and it quite quickly became Sweden's largest newspaper. It's actually quite an interesting story how we became that. We actually founded the first domestic airline in Sweden in order to achieve that. Anywho, for the longest of time, Expressen was Sweden's largest newspaper. However, in 1996, something happened, and we were surpassed by our main competitor, Aftonbladet. Now, this was, of course, significant in the fact that they became Sweden's largest newspaper, but the year, the timing of when they did that was extra significant. Anyone care to guess why? It seems, you see, that the year 1996 also happened to coincide with the year when internet adoption really started to take off in Sweden, as symbolized here. And so by default, Aftonbladet also became Sweden's largest online news site. And so they have been up until now, and they still are. However, today, in 2016, we have again become the largest newspaper in Sweden, in print. But we're still quite a bit behind Aftonbladet when it comes to online. And that's one of the reasons why I'm working for Expressen, because it's one hell of a challenge to be number 2 and try to compete to be number 1. That's really awesome. So very brief story about me. I've been working as a web developer for, I guess, most of my life now, considering that I'm getting old. Doing web development, some startup stuff, also written a couple of books. And 3 years ago, I was working as an independent consultant, being my own boss, which was awesome. And I had this awesome gig. I was working with search technologies, which I love, and we were building a product for other developers to use, and it was well paid, and life was just great. We could use any technologies that we wanted, and everything was awesome. And it was the summer of 2013, and I had this job, but I was on vacation, and I was sitting on an island in the Stockholm archipelago, having a great time, and I decided to check my email. And I found an email, a LinkedIn email from a guy named Peter Frey. And it said in his title that he was the CIO at Aftonbladet, which, typically when you get these headhunter emails, you just throw them away. But getting an email from the largest news site in Sweden was kind of interesting. However, reading his email, it turned out that he had actually just quit. So he was no longer working for Aftonbladet, he had instead joined Expressen. And he sort of explained why he did this later on. And the reason was that he had been with Aftonbladet for 10 plus years and had been with them through their digital journey. And they were number 1, and he was sort of content. Everything was great for him. Problem was just that he didn't want to be content. He wanted a challenge. And what greater challenge could he find than to join their main competitor and essentially compete with himself? So he sent me this email telling me that he was looking for developers to join him in creating a new development department at Expressen. Now, I had this awesome job, and here comes someone who wants to recruit me. So, of course, I sent a really rude email back to him telling him that, no way, I'm not interested, been there, done that, worked with media companies before, worked with Bonnier before, which is the owner of Expressen. I am currently a consultant, and I can do whatever the hell I want. So thanks, but no thanks. For some reason, he kind of liked this email. He likes rude people, I guess. And he managed to convince me to have coffee with him. And multiple coffee cups later, and several weeks went by, and we had this dialogue. And finally, we decided to join forces. So I quit my own consulting gig and joined Peter at Expressen. Now, this was 3 years ago. And at that time, what we found at Expressen was Sweden's second largest news site. So it was kind of a big site. We had 34 million page views each week. However, we had 0 developers in Sweden, which was kind of a problem. We did, however, have 8 developers in Russia. We had, of course, 0 UX designer, and everything was powered, absolutely everything was powered by this one big-ass monolithic .NET application. That is absolutely everything. Needless to say, we had 0 public open source projects, and we did about 2 production deployments per month. They were always done in the middle of the night, and they always went to hell. All of our product development was always based 100% on gut feeling, just guesses, essentially. Now, fast forward to today, 2016, we have grown quite a lot. We now have 83 million page views. We have 47 developers in Sweden. We still have 4 developers in Russia. We really like them. And we have 12 UX designers. Instead of one big monolithic .NET application, we now have 30+ small to medium-sized Node.js applications. The big monolithic .NET application is still around, but we're moving it out. We have published more than 20 open source projects online on GitHub. You're very welcome to check them out. And we now do in excess of 100 production deployments per week. And they never go to hell-ish. But if they do, we roll forward. And our product development approach now is very much data-driven. We do continuous A/B testing, usability testing, eye tracking, and so on. So that's our story very briefly. For the rest of this talk, my goal is to talk about a few slices of our journey, to focus on a few things that I think has worked well for us, and a few things that we sort of have learned from. So we'll start by looking at our technical journey, what we did with this big monolithic .NET application, then how we govern our development department using culture and philosophies, then our product development approach, and then finally how we have managed to scale development, going from essentially 0 developers to 47 developers. Okay, so let's start with our technical journey. The first thing that me and Peter did when we came to Expressen was that we did an inventory of what do we have. And from a technical perspective, what we had was this. We had this one big monolithic application that was the input. It was where journalists wrote their text, and where editors created teasers and uploaded photos and so on, and essentially wrote their stories. And it was also where our public readers consumed the stories that we published. So we had a separate desktop site, and we had a separate mobile site. And it was all powered by this big system running on a host of servers. Now, this system was based on Episerver CMS 6. I don't know if anyone of you have worked with it, but those of you who have, you probably know that it's sort of the equivalent of Windows XP. It's really stable. It works really well. There are bugs, but you tend to know about all of these bugs, and you know that they will never be fixed, and you work around them. And the only problem is that it's old, and it's not really that fun to work with. So what we found was we couldn't really, we could keep this system, but if we did, we probably would want to upgrade it. So we looked at upgrading it. And the problem was just that in order to make Episerver CMS 6 work for a media site, which it really wasn't built for, it was built for small to medium-sized companies or even large companies, but definitely not media sites, our installation of Episerver was highly customized. So upgrading would mean rewriting all of our own customizations, removing a few of them, and migrating a lot of data. I would estimate that to 6 to 12 months or something like that. Problem was just that me and Peter, we wanted to add value from, if not day 1, at least week 1. So upgrading wasn't really an option. So the other option that we thought about was, well, okay, we can't upgrade. Maybe we should rebuild. That's what we developers tend to like to do. So let's spend, I don't know, 1 year, 2 years, making this big bang rebuilding project where we rebuild everything. Awesome. Then we could create something that was really fun to work with, tailor-made for the business, and we could apply every domain-driven design pattern in the world and make it awesome. Again, we wanted to add value from week 1, so rebuilding not really an option. What option were we left with then? Well, we could maintain this old system. Would work. We would be able to add value from week 1. We could just add new features to it. Only problem with that would be that the system would keep on growing, and we would have no plan for the future. And sooner or later, we would have a really hard time finding developers who wanted to work with this. And sooner or later, our users, especially our editors, would start coming to us and say, guys, we can't use this system, it's old. And then we would have to fall back to option number 2, which would be to rebuild, and we would stop adding value. So we needed a fourth option. And we thought about this for quite a while. We went to a few conferences, and we listened to a lot of talks, and we studied what other people had done. One especially interesting inspiration source for us was The Guardian, which does some awesome stuff. And we found our fourth option. And our fourth option consisted of 3 parts, and I'll walk you through each of them. First of all, what we decided to do was, when we want to build new functionality that doesn't belong in this monolithic system, let's not build it in the monolithic system, which is something that you tend to do. When you have a big monolithic system, the easiest way is always to put new functionality in there. So, for instance, at this time, we needed to add login functionality for our public visitors. So what we said then was, OK, this clearly doesn't belong in a content management system, so let's build it as a separate application. And that's what we did. And then we found lightweight ways to integrate that into the existing system. So by taking this decision, we sort of slowed down the growth of the monolith. We still added new features to that application, but it was only features that sort of revolved around our content that belonged in a CMS. Second, we decided, well, we can't rebuild in the form of a big bang release and spend years doing that because we want to add value. But maybe we can look for opportunities to rebuild, but rebuild slowly and adding value at the same time. So at this time, this was in 2014, early, we looked at the graphs for various usages of different devices in Sweden. And what we saw was tablet adoption is really starting to skyrocket in Sweden. It's actually kind of cool. If you look at the graph from various reports from that time, you could see that tablets were actually growing at a higher rate than television at the same time. And so what we saw was an opportunity to offer something unique for tablet visitors. Maybe we should build a separate tablet site. And this was the perfect driving force for us to start migrating slowly away from the system. So what we decided to do was, let's keep the desktop and mobile browsers exactly where they are, but let's start to build a new tablet site, which is separate from the existing system. So we did that by first adding a small module to the monolith that essentially took the data whenever an editor hit the publish button. In addition to making it public on the site, it also took the data, serialized it to JSON, and published it as a message on a message queue. That's it. On top of this, or consuming this, we created an internal API, which we call Ursula, because our theme for applications are The Little Mermaid, and which stored the content. So now we had duplication of our content, which kind of sucks, but this was temporary. And on top of the API, we created a tablet site called Ariel, which is our tablet site. And what we had done by this approach was we have sort of taken a slice of the monolith, because prior to us building Ariel, they were sort of treated as desktop users. So we had moved about 10% of our traffic over to something new. And we had started sort of the foundation for a new architecture. But we did it slowly, and we did it by also adding value for our public visitors. Now, if you fast forward a couple of years, we've also migrated all of the other traffic. So we moved first the desktop site over to Ariel because it was sort of similar. And we created a separate application called Haddock, which for some reason doesn't exist in The Little Mermaid, which is kind of weird, as the mobile site. And we've also actually added a few other sites on top of this, our viral site Omtalat and our magazine sites. So that was step 2. First, we slowed the growth, and then we started to migrate the public visitors. But the editors are still working in Episerver. And what we decided actually from sort of day one was that as long as they're happy working in Episerver, there's no reason for us to move. We have this great Russian team who maintains that system. We can build new stuff. And as long as editors are happy, there's no reason for us to make any changes, because we can build a modern architecture somewhere else by just pulling out the data from there. But about a year ago, they came to us, the editorial staff, and said, guys, this system doesn't really work for us anymore, and our competitors are having much more fun using new editorial tools. So today, we're in the process of building new editorial tools as well, which is not one big system, but rather systems tailored for specific use cases. So we have one system which is tailor-made for publishing articles, another one for managing content on the site, and so on. So to summarize, what we did was First of all, we slowed the growth by saying, OK, let's not put unrelated stuff into this pile of existing crap. We migrated in steps, and we focused all of the time on user needs. So we didn't migrate the CMS until users wanted it. We didn't migrate the sites until we could offer some sort of new functionality to our public visitors. So that's very briefly our technical journey. I could spend 3 hours talking about that, actually more. Anyway, that's something that we started with from day one. Another thing that we started with from day one was starting to build our development department, which was, as you may recall, we had 0 developers in Sweden and 0 UX designers, and I guess we had 2 product owners, but that was it. And we started thinking about what type of development department do we want to build. And of course, we wanted to build a development department where we ourselves wanted to work. We wanted to build a development department where creative individuals could thrive. An organization that was flat, that didn't have a lot of top-down management, where bosses didn't tell workers what to do. We want an organization governed not by rules and regulations, but rather by culture and philosophy. So how do you create that? Well, there are a couple of steps. First of all, you need to think about what should this culture be then? And this is something that is continuously evolving, so I can't really tell you this is our culture. But we came up with 3 pillars that have been with us ever since. And the first pillar is that we want to create a fearless organization. As you may recall, we're Sweden's most brave development department. So we wanted to create an organization where you didn't have any fear of deploying to production, no fear of breaking things, an organization where we didn't have senior developers yelling at junior developers, where you weren't afraid of building the wrong thing. In essence, we want an organization where you're not afraid to screw up. It should be OK to screw up. So that's our first pillar. The second pillar is we wanted an organization without a lot of rules and regulations and policies and whatnot. But in order to have that, we want an organization to rather have a few loose set ways of working that everyone knows. And if you know these things, you're fine. If you live by these things, everything is good. Now, we have a few ways of working. I'm not going to walk you through all of them, but there are 2 which are technical. And the first one is that we always focus on simplicity. We only write the code that we need today. We don't write any code that we need tomorrow or think we need tomorrow. We don't add that extra function parameter to make the code more flexible for tomorrow. So this keeps our code really simple, lean, and agile, I guess. Second principle is that we always do test-driven development. And when we say test-driven development, we don't mean TDD. What we mean is, I guess, what others here at this conference would call BDD. We call it feature testing or black box testing. So as a developer working for us, when you hear a user story or read a user story from someone, your mindset should never be, how do I implement this in code, but rather, how do I write the test for this? And then sort of you work the code out. And this has worked really well for us, especially since we're doing node development. This is really quite possible to do. And we do black box testing. So by doing this, we get developers to A, think about what they're actually doing, rather than just implementing the feature and jumping on the next one. They have to formulate what they're doing in a story that is expressible in code. Second, we create this really great set of tests, which we can always run afterwards, which doesn't test implementation details, but rather the essence of the application, which means that if you break something over here, you are pretty confident that you don't break anything over here, which makes continuous deployment a hell of a lot easier. So that's our second guiding principle. Let's move on to our third pillar of our culture, and that is that we want people to work together. That's actually, the guy there is actually Jens sitting over there, so yeah. Say hi to Jens. So we want people to work together. We want truly empowered teams. So that's nice. Only problem is, how do you accomplish this? So we want an organization not governed by rules and regulations. We want a flat organization where bosses don't tell workers what to do. Well, how do you implement that? You, as a boss, can go to a worker and say, you know, Jens, I think you should not be governed by me, but rather by culture. Would you please implement that? That's sort of counterproductive. So if you can't tell people to be governed by culture and principle, how do you accomplish that? Well, I don't have all the answers for that, but a few things that have worked well for us I can mention. First of all, you can provide tools tools that encourage the behavior that you want. So for instance, we wanted a fearless organization, and we had the situation with this big-ass monolithic .NET application that whenever we deployed it, everything went to hell. Of course, the development team for this application, they were shit scared of doing a deployment. Again, we had fear. So what we did was we invested quite heavily in new tools for deploying this application. We automated everything. We threw out Team Foundation Server and replaced everything with Git and Octopus Deploy and other nice tools, and made previously very manual process that always went to hell, a totally automated process. And what happened was this team started to feel confident when they did deploys. And of course, instead of doing a deploy once or twice per month, they started doing much more continuous deployments. They started doing deployments every week, and then they did deployments every couple of weeks, or every 2 times per week, and so on. So we eliminated fear of deploying to production by providing nice tools for them, but without actually telling them, guys, deploy more often. They figured that out by themselves. Again, we wanted people to deploy often. So another thing we did in order to encourage that, to encourage not having a lot of fear, was that, well, I want people to deploy often. I want continuous deployment because that's cool. Only problem is, again, I can't really go to Jens and tell him you should deploy really often, because that would sort of be counterproductive. So what we did instead was we built a dashboard called Ollie, which we put up on big monitors around our office. And this dashboard shows the number of deployments done today, the number of deployments done this week, the most recent deployments, and most importantly of all, it shows a top list of the most deployed applications for the last 30 days. And what happens in the mind of our developers then is they look at this dashboard. First of all, they don't really know what it is, but then they figure it out, and they see, we're like number 5 here. That's really bad. We should really be number 1. And then they start deploying more often just to compete with other teams, which is, works well for us. So you can gamify and visualize in order to create the behavior that you want. This, of course, doesn't help with people working together. So how do you solve that? Well, in our case, I don't have all the solutions, but something that works for us is that we have truly cross-functional teams. So our teams consists of developers. They also have UX designers, analysts, and most importantly of all, they have product owners in the team. So in our case, for all of our product owners, they're a part of a development team. They're just like any other member of a development team. There's nothing special about them. They're not far away individuals that you meet every 14 or every couple of weeks for sprint planning and demos and stuff like that. They're just like any other member of the team. It's just like it's only that they have another profession within the team. This also means that we have very little need for other functions, such as managers, who runs around and does other stuff, because all the teams are truly self-sufficient. And this means that the teams become really empowered and, again, fearless. So that's a few things that we have done in order to create our culture. And there are probably other things, but those are harder to formulate. So there's a few of those. OK, let's move on to our product development approach, or rather being data-driven. So when me and Peter got to Expressen, in addition to doing a technical inventory, we also did an inventory about how does Expressen currently do product development. And it turned out that in print, they're actually really data-driven. They sort of know what they're doing. They're doing a lot of analysis. As you might have noticed, if you look at a front page here in Malmö and you look at a front page in Stockholm, it's typically different content because they know how to optimize that. But when it came to the web, all of the product development was entirely based on gut feeling and on tradition. Now, of course, gut feeling doesn't have to be bad. If you look at a company such as ours, we have journalists who have been publishing news online for 20 years. So there's a lot of well-trained guts at Expressen. Only problem with gut feeling is just that if you do absolutely everything by gut feeling, you don't really know that your gut feeling works, right? So what we decided to do as a development organization was we decided to go to the other extreme and say, we're going to be 100% data-driven. These other guys, they can be 100% gut feeling driven. But if we combine these two, we'll probably end up somewhere in the middle. So that's what we did. And today, what we do, whenever we have a new feature, we always create a hypothesis for it, which is something that you write down. It doesn't have to be long. It's probably just a few paragraphs. But it's essentially something saying, we believe that if we do this for our users, we will have this effect, and it will be measured this way. So we create a hypothesis, then we implement the experiment, typically as an A/B test. Then we collect the data from it, make analysis of it, and learn from it. And hopefully it proved our hypothesis, but if it didn't, at least we learned something from it, and we store this knowledge away in a knowledge bank. We also do quite a lot of user testing and eye tracking to really understand, okay, this A/B test turned out that it had a positive effect. Why did it have a positive effect? Because the A/B test can't tell you that. So we use user testing and eye tracking to answer such questions, to learn even more. Now, that's not really my area of expertise. So if you want to hear more about user testing and eye tracking, I'm not the person to talk to. So let's talk some more about A/B testing. Here's an example, a really simple example of an A/B test that we did. We wanted to try out different color on our play buttons on the mobile site. So we tried blue, which was the suggestion from our designers. They really thought blue was nice because it was sort of distinct. It matched our company colors, and it was sort of, no one else had a blue play button. So clearly that must be good because it's new. So that was what our designers thought. And then we had this suggestion, which sort of combined blue and red, which was, I think, favored by our editor-in-chief. And then we had the red button. Anyone care to guess which worked best? Correct, of course. So that's nice. I'm glad we tried that out, because clearly blue wasn't the best. In this case, it was really simple to test it, because all we wanted people to do was to click the damn button. However, we also did another A/B test a few years ago, or about a year ago, where we had this idea that below articles on our site, we had top lists for the most read articles today. So it was an automated feature that gave you sort of, here's some more stuff to read. And we had the hypothesis that if we could give our users better content recommendations below articles, maybe they would read more articles. So we built a recommendation engine that sort of looked at the context for the article and did some collaborative filtering, looked at what other people who had read this article also had read, and so on. And we launched this as an A/B test. And the result was great. People clicked a lot more on this one than on that one. Awesome, right? We had probably earned a lot more money. So we could have stopped there, and we could have kept this functionality, and everyone would have been happy. But luckily, we didn't. We decided to look at the overall figures, not just at clicks. And what we found was that by having these nice recommendations, the pattern for our visitors was that they got to our site, then they clicked on a teaser, and they ended up in an article. And on this article, they got this great recommendation, and then they went to another article, which they were recommended. Great. That's 3 page views, which is conversion in our world. However, by having this functionality, we noticed that people were actually making less page views per visit than those who didn't get the nice recommendations. And the analysis of that was, well, what is the alternative to not having recommendations? Well, that's that people go to our start page, then they go to an article. They don't get good recommendations, so then they go back to the start page, and then they go to another article because they still want to consume more content. So that's 4 page views. So I'm kind of glad that we actually not just looked at clicks, but on our overall KPIs instead. Now, we still have these recommendations, but now at least we know the effect of the recommendations. They tend to provide a better user experience, but we're actually losing money on them. Truth be told, we tweaked them a little, so we're not really losing money on them, but we're actually not gaining a lot of money either. But we're gaining more happy users. So it's important to look at your KPIs, not just clicks when you do A/B testing. I want to end my talk about A/B testing by telling you how we do A/B testing, because that's something that we've actually struggled with quite a lot. We've looked at a lot of tools such as Optimizely and so on. Problem with these tools are, one, they tend to be very much focused on clicks, not your overall KPIs or behavior that you want or user happiness or anything like that. It's just clicks, conversion, 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 which tend to be buy, 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 buy. They also tend to bog down your site with these big client-side scripts that usually have to do stuff early on in the page lifecycle and so on. So we tried these tools, but we found that we didn't really like them. So we looked for an alternative solution, and we found one. Here's what we do today. We use Akamai as our content delivery network, but it could be any network infrastructure at all. But to complicate things, we have a content delivery network that caches stuff. And our users make requests to our site. They end up in Akamai. What Akamai then does is we have this special little rule that that tells Akamai that whenever you get a request, look for a cookie with a group value. And if you don't find a group value in this cookie and you are about to send this to our servers, attach a group value. So Akamai randomizes a value between 1 and 100, attaches that to the original request, sends it back to our servers. Our servers respond, and Akamai responds to the client with a response saying, also, by the way, set this cookie value. You're now tagged as being a part of group 42. So what this means is that 100% of our requests are always tagged with these group values. So all of our visitors are categorized between 1 and 100. So we have a nice little bucket of 1% of our users that we can do stuff with. What we then do is, on the client, we instruct the client to log this group value down to our statistics system, our previous existing statistics system, nothing special. And then we can vary our site. So we can do stuff on the client that says, if you're part of group, say, 40 to 45, do this. And if you're a part of any other group, don't do that. And we can do the same in Akamai using edge side includes, or we can do it on our servers if we want to. And then we can simply go to our statistics system and say, how is group 40 to 45 performing compared to some control group, say 46 to 50? And hopefully they're performing better. We can draw some learnings from that, and we make more money. So that's nice. So that's how we do A/B testing. To conclude my talk, let's talk a little bit about how we scale development. So, as I mentioned before, we went from 0 developers in Sweden 3 years ago to 47 developers. That's not unique in any way, but it is a challenge to go from 0 to 47 in 3 years. And there can be a lot of pain doing that. How do we tackle that? Well, first of all, you might remember that our system now looks sort of like this. There are, of course, a lot of more systems, but this is the diagram that I showed you before. Let's simplify that a little bit. What this means is that since we don't have one big monolithic application anymore, instead we have a lot of small applications which all have their own life cycle. If an application has its own life cycle, it's kind of easy to have separate teams working on that. So today we have about 7 development teams, and all of the teams are maintaining 1 or more applications or owning 1 or more applications. And they can work fairly independently of each other, which makes it kind of nice to scale. However, this does bring a couple of problems. First of all, they all tend to have, if we go back here, we can see that they all tend to have sort of a dependency on the API in some way or another. Some feed the API, some read from the API. So we sort of have that monolith again. So one solution to that is, well, we have this big system and everyone has a dependency on that. The typical management approach to that would be, well, then clearly we need a big API team that can work on this and that can handle requests from all the other teams. So what you end up with then is a situation where you have a big API team with a product owner, and then you have multiple site teams that have dependencies on the API. And they make feature requests. They go to their product owner, who goes to the API team's product owner, who goes to a developer in the API team. Nice. Looks really good in a PowerPoint because it's kind of structured. However, this results in a couple of problems. First of all, you have multiple teams that all need to do some work in order to implement a single feature. And then you need to schedule when does this happen. And that in turn leads to meetings, or what typically called Scrum of Scrums. And while these guys are away on their Scrum of Scrums, this developer is sort of idling because she has nothing else to do. So she's waiting. That's one of the problems. It brings meetings. The other problem is that when you have this model, what happens with context? So this girl here over here, she knows exactly what she needs to implement on her site. Only problem is, along the way, context is sort of lost. So the API team developer, when the request finally reaches him, he really has no clue what this is about. Probably the request is sort of, I need an endpoint to do yada, yada, yada. It doesn't say anything about why. So our model is quite different. What we do instead is we have this really small API team. It's essentially Jens and maybe a couple of other people. And we still have fairly large site teams. And when the site team wants something in the API, well, our motto in the API team is we accept pull requests. So instead of the developer in the site team asking for a feature and context is lost, she, who has all the context, can damn well implement the feature in the API herself and send a pull request. Does this sound familiar, this model? It's sort of an exact blueprint copy of the open source community. You have a few core committers to a project, but then you have a lot of other contributors. Now, this brings a few benefits. One is that the API team developers are sort of, their time is sort of freed up because they don't have to do a lot of work on the API, or rather they can build new features in the API, which maybe the site team wants to use. And since they have a lot of time on their hands, they can actually implement the feature all the way out on the site and make a pull request in reverse. And this in turn means that the site team developers get to know a lot about our APIs. We sort of share the ownership of our APIs, and our API team knows our sites and so on. Of course, you still have to have ownership, and so, but that works exactly like in open source with core committers and so on. And it's worked really well for us. Okay, so that sort of concludes my talk. I want to summarize quickly, but before we do, I think we have a couple of minutes for questions in case anyone has any. Yeah. It again depends on context. There are no rules. It kind of depends. If you have a pull request to me and you want it released now, well, then you own it for now and you deploy it and make sure that everything works. You test it afterwards and see, smoke testing and so on. But you can also say, I want this pull request, but it's not urgent, and then I take ownership of it, and whenever I have something else that I want to deploy, I deploy it, and so on. So it really depends on the context and so on. There are no rules.